Hi, my name is Matt Parker. You can find me on Twitter at RealMattKParker. I've never spoken at DevOps Enterprise Summit before. So before I get into the talk, I'm just going to share a few things about myself to introduce myself to this awesome audience. I hope to be back at future talks as well. So I'm an author. I'm working on a book. It has the same title as this talk. It's called Work Radical. It's about radically collaborative organizations. And I'm working with IT Revolution on that book, and the same publisher that puts together this conference. And I'm really thankful to be working with them. They're amazing. Something you might remember me by, I'm a third generation programmer. My dad was a programmer. His dad was a programmer. My oldest daughter is learning programming right now. So maybe she will decide that she really wants to stick with it and become a fourth generation programmer. That doesn't say anything about my abilities. Obviously, programming is not an inherited trait. I just think it's kind of cool, and hopefully it's something you can remember me by. Before I went on hiatus to write a book, my most recent role was head of engineering at Pivotal Labs, which is a worldwide consultancy that specializes in extreme programming and lean product development and human-centered design. So I'll have more to say about them during this talk. So a couple more things. I used to live here. This is First Avenue in Manhattan, and yet last year, my wife and I decided to move ourselves and our 3 kids here to the wilds of Connecticut. This is the clearing behind our home. I took this with my iPhone. We are super thankful and feel incredibly lucky to have made this move before the pandemic started. I think we would have gone totally insane, cooped up in our Manhattan apartment with our 3 kids. All right, so this talk, radical collaboration. I'm going to introduce a lot of the some of the key concepts and findings. I don't have time to go into everything, obviously, but maybe in future talks at future DevOps Enterprise Summits, I'll tell more and more about the book and some of the ideas in it and stories from it. The first kind of thing I want to just talk about is radical collaboration itself. What is it? So it's something I'm sure you have all experienced at some point in your life, even if it's not the norm in your working life. But if you've ever had an experience of working with someone or even playing with someone that is incredibly fun, yet enriching and challenging, and there's all kinds of learning that goes on in it, but it's also something that's marked by care and safety, then you radically collaborated. And I think it's an incredibly important and valuable experience for us to have, and there's no reason every organization out there can't be doing it. So that's why I'm passionate to give this talk and to write the book. I also have experienced both radically collaborative organizations in my working life, but also the opposite of that. And actually, my first internship 20 years ago, almost to the day, was in a place that looked a lot like this. It was a cube farm, and if you take away all the plants and you take away every other fluorescent light, this is basically exactly what it looked like. And notice that there are no windows. That part is actually quite accurate too, because my first internship in IT was in a cube farm that was in a basement. And it was pretty depressing and demoralizing. And so I wondered why I majored in computer science. There's this quote I read at the time: "Today's office is a wasteland. It saps vitality, blocks talent, frustrates accomplishment. It is the daily scene of unfulfilled intentions and failed effort." And I thought, wow, that sums up this experience perfectly. And then I figured out who actually said that. And it's this designer. His name was Robert Probst, and he was actually the inventor of the cubicle. So he was actually talking about places that looked a lot like this and like this. In other words, he was talking about the open office paradigm, which was the dominant office paradigm for the first 2/3 of the 20th century. So I want to make it clear from the outset that radical collaboration has a lot more going for it than just the way the office is laid out. You can't lay an office out in a certain way and somehow generate radical collaboration. There's a lot more to it. So that may be part of it, and we'll talk about that. Okay. So radical collaboration is nothing new. It's quite old. And actually, if we just take a brief moment to look at the history of the Industrial Revolution till now, we can sort of see it as a movement largely away from radical collaboration. I love this painting. It's of an early factory, sort of at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And this is, I think, a pretty accurate sort of rendition of it based on historical documents as well, because even though they had newfangled machines in these factories that could speed up production in certain ways, the reality was it was pretty chaotic and self-organizing. Almost all the people that came into these factories at first were really highly skilled craftspeople that before this were building products end to end, like themselves or with others, but really just had a whole wide range of skills. And so in these early factories, they still kind of made that way, and it was pretty self-organizing. And for the most part, a lot of these environments were radically collaborative. But it didn't last long. You know, by the dawn of the 20th century, the factories became more and more kind of mechanized and componentized, and the work inside it became very, very specialized. And you just did one little thing and did your one little piece and passed it off to somebody else. And we made the assembly line because of that specialization. This is a Ford assembly line in the early days. And that's still the way we make today for the most part. You know, not just cars, but all kinds of things are manufactured through a basic sort of assembly line process, whether it's lean or not. And on the other hand, it just has led to this sort of dystopian sort of image that we see all the time now inside factories, where it feels like all the humanity and all the collaboration has just been sucked straight out of it somehow. And, you know, it's not surprising that researchers go in and discover high levels of depression and stress and anxiety among makers that make in environments like this. Okay, so most manufacturers know that those kind of things do exist, the stress, anxiety, and depression, but not a lot have actually tried to do anything about it. And Volvo is one of the exceptions. In the mid-70s, they built a couple of factories where they started to experiment and iterate with a different way of making. They didn't put any assembly lines in these factories, and they just put teams together and said, you know what, like, can all of you just make a car end to end? What would it take? And they began to work